The Helm of Or is probably one of the most recognized Icelandic symbols, and according to Norse law, anyone who wears this symbol in battle will be protected from harm. In this video, we will explore the origin of the symbol. I will dig into mythological and academic sources, and I will show you my approach to find its origin, and I hope that you will leave this video more enlightened. The symbol can be found in grimoires, also called books of magic or books of spells. In contrast to how the Vikings have been portrayed in popular literature, the use of magic was actually a big part of the Nordic religion. It was the women who, according to our current understanding, were the religious leaders, and therefore magic was mostly practiced by women. But there are also plenty of examples of how men used magic in the Norse sagas. The symbol is a stave, a rune spell, and they were carved or painted onto objects for them to take effect. These objects could be pillars, pieces of bark, bones, dirt, or even parts of the body. It is doubtful if these rune spells were written down in books during the Viking Age. If they were written down, it would most likely have been on animal hide or bark, which would decay. Books did not begin to appear before paper became more accessible, and many of these magic books were probably turned into ash in the flames of fear during the Dark Ages. Before we move on, I just want to mention that many of the names that I'm going to pronounce will be pronounced as we do in Danish. I'm also going to pronounce the Helm of Or as we do in Danish, which is Ægishjelm. The oldest attestation of the symbol that we know of is in the poem Fafnismal from the Poetic Edda. In this poem, stanza 16, it is written, "I carried a helmet of the Frightener, Ægishjelm, among men while I laid upon the treasures. I thought myself stronger than all. I did not meet many men." This stanza tells us that there was something called the Helm of Or that not only boosted the confidence of the wearer, but also made them feel incredibly strong. I thought myself stronger than all. It should be said while the name Ægishjelm is mentioned, there is no depiction of the symbol in this or any of the other Norse sagas. It could have been an actual helm because Sigurd, the one who defeated Fafnir and took the treasure, did also take the helm as part of the hoard. I would also like to point out that Dr. Jackson Crawford has said, and I quote, "It seems to be some kind of actual physical helmet, and yet today what is famous under the name Ægishjelm is not some kind of physical helmet that you put on your head, but a symbol that comes from a much later manuscript. This manuscript is called LBS 143 8VO, and it was compiled in the mid-1600s. The symbol Ægishjelm is depicted on page 11R, where it is described as Ægishjelm. It must be made in lead and printed on one's forehead when a man has an expectation that he might meet his enemy, and you will overcome him. There are also other manuscripts, for instance, the manuscript called AM 434A, or the Icelandic Dark Magic Book from the 1500s that has both a description and an image of the symbol. I won't go into details on these since they are heavily blended with Christendom, but I will point out that this is another example of the blending of cultures. Many people were pagan long after the Viking Age ended, and it took generations to convert them. Many of these rune spells would later be used in the Hull manuscript, which is probably the most known collections of spells, because among them there is the famous Vegvisir symbol. I have already made a video about that symbol, so I won't go into more details about it. This is the point where I want to introduce you to Professor Stephen Edred Flowers, who is a renowned scholar, runologist, a proponent of Asatru, and an author of dozens of books. For instance, the book called Icelandic Magic, Practical Secrets of Northern Grimoires, which I have used a lot for the following part of this video, and a book that I highly recommend. I have placed a link to the book in the description. According to Stephen E. Flowers, it seems to have been symbolized as an actual helmet. However, it originally meant simply covering, which is the oldest sense of the term helm. Therefore, the whole formula would signify covering of awe or terror. I think that it is very interesting that it could be seen as a covering, and it would also make a lot more sense because why would a serpent wear a helmet as protection? The scales of the serpent are armor in itself. The Helm of Awe was originally a kind of spear of magical power to strike fear into the enemy. It was associated with the power of serpent to paralyze their prey before striking, hence the connection with Fafnir. We have to stop thinking about the helm as just a symbol to be drawn onto the forehead, because it is much more than that. It is a spell that can be used as protection. According to Stephen E. Flowers, the symbol does not just protect the head of the wearer, but instead it protects the entire being. This can be achieved with the use of two different methods, subjectively or objectively. Let me paint a visual image for you. If the spell is cast subjectively, it will protect the wearer with a magical shield, just like when Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings fought the demon known as a Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. He stopped the demon from passing the bridge by casting a white shield that protected him from being hit by the flame sword. If the spell is cast objectively, it functions as a transformation spell, just like when the dwarf Fafnir transformed himself into the form of a serpent or dragon to protect his treasure. Is it really just a coincidence that the word Ægishjálmr is mentioned in Fafnismal, and that there is a depiction of the symbol with a similar description that actually could fit the description in the saga? Of course, we have to remember that there were still around 300 years between the two publications of the two books, but it does make you wonder, right? There is one source that I would like to put on the table, and a source that I have not seen anyone else use in the connection with this symbol, and that is the golden horns of Galehus that was discovered in Denmark. These two golden horns have been dated to the early 5th century, which is within the Germanic Iron Age and prior to the Viking Age. What is interesting about these golden horns in this context is the symbols. I won't go through everything since I have already made a video about the golden horns of Galehus, so we are just going to focus on one particular symbol, which is located at the top of one of the horns. When I saw this symbol the first time, I was like, by Odin's beard, I have seen that one before. It may not look exactly identical to the one depicted in the Book of Magic, but the symbol could have evolved through the millennium. A popular source that is often used in the connection with Germanic paganism and to explain the origin of the rune spells are the keys of Solomon. There might be some truth to that, but if these keys can be interpreted as the Helm of Awe while only having a similar appearance, then the same thing could be said for the depiction on the golden horn. I would like to point out that when we tend to think about this symbol, we always visualize it with 8 arms stretching outwards from the center. This way of depicting the symbol has become quite common, and it can be found in most, if not all, stores that sell Viking-inspired jewelry. But according to Stephen E. Flowers, there are various versions of this symbol. It can consist of 4, 6 or 8 arms, with other symbols along its arms. The number of arms and the shape of the helm depends on which magical space the magician wants to be modeled. The 8-armed Helm of Awe is a reference to the 4 cardinal directions and 4 vertical worlds along an axis both above and below the subject as conceived of anywhere in space. The two inner worlds on the vertical axis are both above and below the subject, but the other two on the vertical pole are actually in another dimension of time and space. These correspond to the realm from which events originate and the realm where transformations are made. Obviously, the number of arms gives an indication of the way in which magical space is being modeled. Typically, the helm have 8, 6 or 4 arms. 8 arms refer to the 8 divisions of the sky and earth. 6 arms refer to the 4 cardinal points and a vertical axis, while 4 arms refer to the cardinal points of the mundane universe. However, many more configurations are possible. If we take a look at the golden horns again, then we can see there's only one symbol that looks like the Helm of Or, but it clearly looks different than the rest. It stands out. Its placement is also very interesting, right next to 2 warriors with their weapons drawn. According to the researcher Finn Rasmussen, this is a depiction of the Germanic heaven. The 2 figures with horns are divine twins. The one on the left is the god of life and growth, which is symbolized with the ring that symbolizes the circle of life, and a wand that symbolizes an object that can revive things. The twin also has a spear in its hand, which symbolizes strength and courage. The divine twin on the right is the god of death and harvest, which is symbolized with the sickle. This makes me wonder if the Grim Reaper, that has been depicted many times in Christianity, has roots in German paganism. The twin also has a stick in the left hand to guide people through the realm of the dead. I've been thinking about this section of the horn for quite some time, and is it possible that this is a depiction of a ritual conducted by religious leaders who cast the rune spell on the warriors before a battle? We have found helmets that look similar to this. These have been dated to the Bronze Age, and they were found at Læksø in Zealand, Denmark. Another thought that I had, and I just want to clarify that I don't smoke any kind of herbs, but could they be a depiction of interdimensional beings that somehow are related to the use of magic? As I said earlier, the spell can also be extended objectively to protect the surroundings of the magician, for instance, groups of people. According to Stephen E. Flowers, what makes this simple and especially powerful map of magic is that it connects the subjective and objective universes in a synthetic way, which gives the inner will of the magician a high level of influence over the objective universe, because both realms are clearly seen as part of the same whole. This can be illustrated in a 2-dimensional drawing. The objective universe is the surroundings of the magician. The subjective universe is the soul and mind of the magician. And at the core is the goal of the intent of the magic. According to Stephen E. Flowers, these zones can be adjusted based on empirical results of magical experiments. In casting the Helm of Or, the magician is to imagine the arms of the sign as currents of force emitting from the core of his being and flowing both outwardly and inwardly, being protected forcefully, remaining steady, being received forcefully, or being blocked, redirected, or circulated as the sign determines. Again, the key is that the sign is not 2-dimensional, but it exists on at least 4 dimensions. This clearly indicates that magic cannot just be conducted by anyone. The person has to have an almost spiritual connection and be confident in it. This emotional aspect may explain why it was mostly women who not only were the religious leader of society, but also more often someone who practiced magic. For a spell to be cast successfully, it is probably necessary that the emotions have to be controlled, focused and guided by the force, and someone cannot just pick up a book and begin to cast rune spells. The person has to have an almost inner calmness and be in control of the self, which only comes with meditation. In contrast to what some people may think, meditation is not just used in religions such as Hinduism or Buddhism, but it was also practiced within Germanic paganism. So when some Western people feel that they have more in common with Buddhism, they are actually just reaching back to their own pagan roots. If we take a closer look at this symbol, then the Helm of Or has allegedly been made by using sea runes as its arms. This rune is called Algis, and it is part of the runic alphabet Elder Thudak. Its transliteration is the letter C, and in Scandinavia it's R. This rune is also part of the runic alphabet Younger Thudak, where it is called Yr. Here the transliteration is also R in Scandinavia. This rune is associated with protection and prevailing over one's enemies, which is most likely why it was used for this symbol. Along the arm is the Isa rune, which also appears in both of the runic alphabets. The transliteration of this rune is the letter I, and the meaning of the Isa rune is ice. If you think that it is only the Icelandic language that is filled with words from Old Norse, then you should rethink that opinion, because, for instance, in Danish the word for ice is is. Of course, it is difficult to know if this is in fact the Isa rune along its arms, but if it is, then it is quite interesting. The use of this rune could be understood as the Helm of Or was hardened with the strength of ice. Ice can be an incredible hard and resistant element that can almost be impossible to break without the right tools. Therefore, it would make sense that the ancients thought of ice as being unbreakable and therefore used it as part of a magic shield. Could this mean that the Helm of Or is a magical shield that consists of ice and a spell that is cast subjectively to protect the wearer and their surroundings? And was this, in fact, a rune spell that was used in connection with resisting violent encounters, while still being able to fight back and defeat the enemy? Or was it just something that you painted on your forehead to scare off the enemy? I would like to insert one of my own speculations. In my opinion, the middle of the symbol looks a lot like the Sun Cross, which is a very ancient symbol that can be seen across many cultures. But is it possible that the Sun Cross could have had more lines, for instance, in order to split the year into dates that could somehow have been important? Is it possible that the Helm of Or has the Sun Cross in the center? I have not seen anyone else write about it, but it was just a thought that crossed my mind. These images on the stones have been found in many parts of Scandinavia, and they date back to the Bronze Age. Everyone is in agreement that this is a sun cross. So if this represented the sun, then what the heck is this? I mean, it does look like an early depiction of the Helm of or is my imagination running wild? All of these images are from the rock carvings in Tanum, Sweden, and they have been dated to the Bronze Age. This image allegedly depicts two women and the Sun Cross. The Sun Cross is also depicted above two warriors in what looks to be a battle scene. Of course, this could just be the sun. I am not concluding anything. I just thought it was interesting. The exact age of the Helm of Or is unknown, but claiming that it has no ties to the Viking Age, while there are similar symbols and the name is the same as the depiction from the book published in the 1600s, is in my opinion a bit ridiculous. There is clearly some form of connection across hundreds of years, and possibly even all the way back to prehistoric time, when the people carved their life onto rocks. I think that there is still a lot of research that can be conducted in connection with this symbol, and I think that there is still a lot to be discovered. Academical and mythological research is important, but we cannot neglect to look at the philosophical and spiritual aspects. If we take everything too literally and don't try to think outside the box, then we may never understand how the ancient people thought. This is not an exact answer to the origin of the symbol, but it was never my intention to make that path through time. The intention was exploration and to make you more enlightened about the fact that everything may not always be as it seems, and that there is clearly more to this symbol than what we know. If you want to see more videos like this, then please consider joining the channel so I have the means to continue. The more time I have on my hands, the deeper I can dig and the better the videos can get. Your contribution is the ink that fuels the pen and supports me in spreading the ancient knowledge of the past for future generations to see. If you don't want to join the channel, or if you can't join the channel, then please share the video with a friend. I wish you all a great day. See you next time for another video. Thank you for watching.